So now we could begin to discuss the major shift that occurs in U.S. foreign policy, in our foreign policy attitude and approach, happening during the turn of the 20th century, during the late 1800s into the 1900s. And that's a transition from isolationism towards that of internationalism. And in our context of this class, internationalism could be basically understood as imperialism, right? The act of imperialism, of colonizing regions abroad, asserting our power outside the boundaries of the country. Okay, first of all, let's define isolationism here. What is isolationism? Well, it refers to a foreign policy or approach whereby a given nation minimally interferes or intervenes in global affairs. Okay, the preferred attitude, the preferred approach is towards non-intervention, right? Not to get involved in the affairs that are happening throughout the rest of the world. Rather, the preference is to look only domestically, to be only involved in domestic issues rather than international issues. Okay? Now, I have to mention here that this was exactly the U.S.'s approach towards foreign policy from, let's say, 1800 to 1890. All right, more or less. I'm not saying that we were completely isolationist, but for the most part, this was the tradition upheld by American policymakers throughout most of the 19th century, isolationism. Okay, so during this period, the U.S. did not really assert itself overseas. It didn't really play a part on the world stage, so to speak. In fact, among the general public, foreign policy or foreign affairs excited very little interest among them. Okay, this is because of that isolationist doctrine that took hold. So let's explore some specific reasons for isolationism during this era of U.S. history. For one, it was indeed a political tradition, okay, political reasons for internationalism. That is to say, that the American outlook politically was insular. It was inward, not outward. Okay. In fact, that isolationist politics was echoed in various speeches given by presidents. Our first president, right, George Washington, said this exactly in his farewell address, which, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we shouldn't get involved in entangling alliances abroad. Okay, what did he mean? He's saying, as this new nation that he's the first president of, let's not get involved in those imperial conflicts that are happening, especially in Europe, right? Let's isolate ourselves from that. In fact, a later president, his name is John Quincy Adams. He's the son of an earlier president, John Adams. And he issued a famous sort of directive in his speech about foreign policy being isolationist. And famously, it goes like this, that America, quote, should not go abroad in search for monsters to destroy, unquote, okay? Meaning, again, that let's not get involved in these entangling alliances again, right? To quote Washington once again, let's focus inward. Let's be insular in our outlook. Okay, another reason you could cite as being economic. Okay, and to be specific, during this time, America was just focusing on a form of what you'd call economic nationalism. And this basically refers to that approach in your economics whereby you just focus on economic development within your country and not really in depending on other nations, right? It's a form of trying to nurture self-reliance on your economics. Okay, so stated otherwise, our economy this developmental stage still did not rely on foreign markets for various, trading goods. Foreign markets were not yet essential. And this is largely due to the fact of not only economic nationalism, but also to, um, it was a period of our the early period, I should say, of our industrial revolution, whereby what was outputted in this context in the factories, our industrial output, could basically be absorbed by internal demand. Okay, so let me state that another way. This is the beginning of our industrial revolution that happens, let's say, mid 1800s, and at that point of our industrial revolution, everything we produced in our factory system, right, the industrial system, could be domestically consumed. Okay, and therefore we didn't have to worry about trying to find foreign markets to absorb any, let's say, surplus. In fact, there was no such thing as surplus yet at this juncture. Okay, so again, foreign markets were not yet essential, right? And this is a period of economic nationalism. Now, another reason is that this kind of links everything together. America was focusing its energies on expansionism in a geographical sense, and we know this as westward expansion, right? And not only that, developing our economy, something I alluded to just earlier, okay? These are all domestic issues. Continental expansion, economic development, right? It does not depend heavily upon foreign affairs. Okay. Now, another reason, and this is the fourth reason I'm citing here, is a matter of simple geography. That is, we have this considerable distance from Europe, so we could kind of, remain unattached from, the entangling alliances, to use Washington again. Not to mention, we're surrounded by two large oceans. So in that sense, we're geographically isolated, right? So this distance from the European continent enabled us to be insulated from its political troubles. Okay, so we didn't have to be involved in affairs in Europe. Now, this is the opposite. If you happen to be a country in Europe, let's imagine you're landlocked and you're surrounded by various empires. It seems inevitably the case that somehow you're going to be entangled in the imperial affairs of these empires, right? For America, at this stage, we were secure, right? We had the security of two oceans separating us, and therefore, in a geographic sense, again, enabling that isolationist standpoint. Okay, so this basically are the reasons for isolationism. Now the question emerges, what factors would lead to changes in America's foreign policy outlook? And why did expansionism overseas suddenly become a permanent feature and remain so today when you think about it? How, or why does that become a permanent feature of American foreign policy? And here we have to specifically look at the 1890s as a pivotal decade. So what we're discussing really here is that transition again from isolationism towards that of internationalism. Why the fundamental change here? Okay, first of all, we have to acknowledge this, that in 1890, the frontier was declared as closed by the U.S. Census, the U.S. government. What does that mean? It means that the country, the nation of the United States, has expanded geographically from sea to shining sea, so to say. And, you have California, Oregon, and Washington State incorporated now. And the frontier to the west no longer existed. Okay, What exists to the west is the Pacific Ocean. All right, so in other words, it's the closing of the frontier, the end of westward expansion. Now, here is a crucial question that you should take note of, and it relates to that shift to internationalism. Does the closure of the frontier signal the end of American expansionism? Did westward expansion stop once we reached the shores of the Pacific in 1890? Okay, well, I already sort of hinted at this earlier, right? No, it doesn't stop. Okay, westward expansion will continue after 1890 across the Pacifics. In a way, you could connect the two processes. In a way, you could say our movement into the Pacific region was inexorably the same process as the continental expansion. They're the same inexorable process. Right? Okay, another reason that's crucial here is economic. I just mentioned that, we're undergoing the throes of industrial revolution, but still, during many of the decades of the 1800s, what we produced industrially could be consumed by domestic consumption. But by the 1890s, that was no longer the case. Why? Because what came into existence was a state of affairs that economists call economic overproduction. Okay, so that's a key term here. Economic overproduction. Overproduction refers to, again, a state of affairs whereby domestic output could no longer be absorbed by domestic consumption. Therefore, you develop surplus in what you're producing industrially as an economy. Okay, you're overproducing. So what is the remedy for economic overproduction when you think about it, right? How can you cure this state of affairs known as economic overproduction, which is a negative state of affairs? Well, the perceived solution is to seek foreign markets. Seek markets abroad, that is, different nations that could be a possible market for your surplus goods. Okay, so just to state it otherwise, before 1890, there was no, if you will, this urgent situation of economic overproduction. Okay, it was not yet an exigency, but by 1890, it indeed turned into an exigency. The exigency of economic overproduction by 1890 meant that the U.S. should indeed search for foreign markets, to look for markets abroad outside its own borders, and find prospective consumers of its surplus. And still another reason, and this is the third reason, for that shift towards internationalism, is the simple fact that the United States is developing, certainly economically they are. In fact, by 1900, we would surpass England as the greatest industrial power in the world. Okay, so we are rising in that hierarchy of great countries. And therefore, the U.S. develops a newfound desire to compete with European empires and to become a superpower, to use a more modern term, right? The superpower. Yet, how do you establish greatness? How do you put yourself in league with other great empires? Well, you have to play the game of empire itself. You must become imperial if you want to be great, at least back then. Okay, so that meant the U.S. has to play ball, so to speak. We need to become an empire if we want to be regarded on the global stage as a great country, and that's indeed what happens. We pursue the empire largely because we seek status before the rest of the world.